You note in your article, and I quote, Labor politicians had also become strong proponents of the central bank independence, religiously reminding us all the RBA was solely responsible for rate rises, end quote. Now, Nick, that's a useful political line for Labor to run, but it's not entirely true, is it? It was only a few weeks ago the RBA actually blamed Labor's wage increase on the latest round of rate rises.
Yes, that's correct. All of a sudden, even Labor backbenchers have become kind of expert in Reserve Bank independence. Every time they talk about it, they say it's an independent decision of the Reserve Bank, if that's when they raise rates. Of course, when rates were falling, and we really saw basically declining rates from the mid-1990s really up until 18 months ago, there was just this trend downward. Of course, no politicians during that phase were saying the Reserve Bank was independent. They were saying they were quite happy to take the sort of congratulations for lower and lower rates. But now they're going up. Of course, there's a push to really show separation between these rate increases and the politicians. But the fact is that the government profoundly impacts on RBA decisions, one through the budget, secondly through what it can do in terms of wages policy. And over the long term, a really critical factor, Alexandra, is the rate of productivity. When I was talking before about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, remember I said that if aggregate demand was running too strong, then what the Reserve Bank had to do was pull that back with interest rates. But there is another way of dealing with that strong aggregate demand, and that is increasing aggregate supply. And all the debate you hear about productivity, it's all about that. What can we do to make sure when demand runs hot, there can be a business supply response? And it's on this front, productivity, that we're seeing some really sad numbers. And the government, I think, has rightly been criticised for not doing enough to improve our supply side.
Yeah, well, they could always try cutting some of the red tape that's killing most industries who are trying to keep up. But there was an interesting line in your piece, and I quote again, ever since the Aston by-election on April 1, interest rates have risen 50 basis points, yet you still don't sense the political tide is turning. Home borrowers appear fatalistic, passively accepting their plight. Now, Nick, is there a limit to this fatalism that we're seeing amongst home buyers? Because who can forget when the public annihilated the Keating government and Labor as a political concept on the back of interest rate hell? Is history going to repeat itself if Albanese keeps on this path?
Well, it remains to be seen, but you would think there is going to be a point where home borrowers go, we just can't take this enough anymore. And it really does get to this point about whether the links are going to be fully understood. Now, there's the drivers of inflation. We've spoken about that. There's also a pretty important factor about, well, who should, if we are going to constrain aggregate demand, who should be constrained? Because at the moment, really the only group which has been constrained in terms of their spending are those that are affected by higher interest rates, which are those that borrow. But there are people that just have deposits, and they actually benefit from higher interest rates because they get more interest on their deposits. So I think at some point, home borrowers are going to go, well, how come we are bearing just the whole burden? Shouldn't it be spread more widely? Now, one of the suggestions, of course, is to spread the burden of constraint more widely. There are lots of innovative things government could do. For example, they could do a temporary lift in the GST. They could just raise it, and therefore all of us are going to spend less. There could be some more things they do in taxation, but most importantly, what they should be doing is cutting their own wasteful spending. If the government cuts its own wasteful spending, then the burden of trying to pull this inflation journey back will be spread more widely and much more fairly.